I think if you're going to talk about Scotland, I think you have to start talking about Ireland, because Ireland is such an emblematic country. People hold up Ireland, say, look, they cut taxes and they had the Celtic Tiger, and it's a complete myth, that story. So maybe can we start talking about that now? Because I think it's essential to understand what actually happened in Ireland. And again, there's another thing that happened in 1956, which is really interesting. So there's this myth that Ireland sort of became a tax haven, both in tax terms, but they had this kind of, the Irish Financial Services Centre in Dublin is a kind of Wild West deregulated place. And there's this myth that this is what caused the sort of remarkable spike in Irish growth. Actually, the story is completely different. So Ireland started trying to be a tax haven in 1956. Again, a complete coincidence, but that's what happened. And if you look at the effect on the economic growth of Ireland, so there's various ways to measure it, but one particularly good way is gross national product. And this is for technical reasons. If you take gross domestic product, there's all sorts of stuff that is kind of profit shifting into Ireland through the tax haven activity, which doesn't touch the sides, but in GDP figures, it shows up. So you get this great inflation of GDP figures in Ireland. But if you take gross national product, you get a better approximation, and obviously gross national product per capita. So I looked at that a little while ago, and how that worked out since 1956, when Ireland started trying to be a tax haven with offering sort of very low corporate tax rates. And if you take gross national product per capita as a share of the European average, that's probably one of the best ways to see how well is Ireland doing, because if it's going up, maybe all European countries are going up, but if you do it as a share of the European average, you get a better measure. So that's the measure I looked at. And from 1956, the measure completely flatlined. It flatlined and flatlined and flatlined through decades. And then in 1992, 1993, suddenly, like a hockey stick, it just went through the roof. And there was a massive explosion of economic activity. And, Ireland's, on that measure, sort of share of the European average, it rose from like 60% of the average to 120, 130%. In the space of a few years. And that was a growth miracle that everybody was very excited about. Now, nothing changed in the tax rate there. In fact, Ireland had it's got a famous 12.5% corporate tax rate. That came in about 10 years after the boom began. So it wasn't that did it. And in fact, that was an increase of the corporate tax rate from 10%. So that wasn't what did it. What did do it? Well, in fact, what happened in 1992-93, of course, was Ireland's accession to the European single market. That's really the fundamental thing. But in fact, there was a whole series of events that all came together at the same time to push Ireland's growth up. And so there was the accession to the single market, which was a big one. But there was also, at that time, there was a sudden massive global investment boom. From it quadrupled between 1991 and 1999, which is this very short period of massive growth that we saw. And most of that was led by US corporations. And of course, where European corporations want to invest in the European single market, they want a platform which is English speaking, which is friendly. A lot of corporate CEOs had Irish ancestry, and Irish is just a lovely, friendly place. And so plenty of it went to the UK, but Ireland took a disproportionate share of this investment. And so you had, a quadrupling of global investment, and Ireland, because of its role as a sort of friendly English-speaking place with lots of connections to the US, took a disproportionate amount of that FDI. You also had the Irish Development Agency, which was a really proactive, really impressive agency that was just a fantastically set up agency that used all kinds of really clever marketing that sort of got, the investment that was pumping out around the world. They got it to come to Ireland instead of somewhere else. So that's another thing that's kind of worth bearing in mind. But there were other things, there were massive education reforms in Ireland in the 1980s, which by the time of the boom were just starting to pump, much, a whole sluice of well-educated people into the workforce. There had been EU-inspired deep changes to the role of women in the workforce. And so at that time, you had a sudden surge of, I think in 6 years around that period, there was like a 25% increase in the number of women, women who had been working in the home. 25% of them moved into the workforce just in a short period of time. And you had, the peace process in Northern Ireland adding to a kind of halo effect. So you had all these factors coming together all at the same time. And that's what caused this boom. The low corporate tax rate and the sort of tax loopholes certainly would have contributed to the intensity of that boom, but they also contributed to the intensity of the crash that followed. And so it's and if Ireland had a much higher tax rate, it hadn't had this kind of tax haven approach, it would have got most of this investment anyway, but it would have been able to tax it properly. So it could have had an even bigger and certainly more sustainable boom than it had. So it's not possible to replicate those things. EU accession is obviously one hot potato, but generally those other factors are not replicable. So Ireland is not, if you want to use it as an inspiration, then you have to be very careful about what actually happened and what were the causes for Ireland's economic success. And one thing that it emphatically wasn't was being a tax haven. That's not, that was a kind of that was just it was so convenient to use for the sort of multinationals and everyone saying, oh look, Ireland cut taxes, had low taxes, and it got this fantastic boom. That's the story that so many people love to tell, and I think many Irish people still believe that. I think there's a lot of cynicism now about it, but the reality is that it was other factors that really were the foundation of the boom.
Yeah, I mean, you'll remember that Salmond was talking about the Irish economic tiger, but I follow. We both follow David McWilliams. We're both patrons of David McWilliams' podcast, so we follow what's going on economically in Ireland as well. And it's not necessarily a model that I would hold up. I am aware that it has been involved in tax havenry, but that they also have resultant problems. We have huge problems with their housing market, and they have, like the Netherlands has now, really a two-tier healthcare system. So people who are more wealthy are getting better healthcare than people who are less wealthy. So this is not a model that I'm enthusiastic about.
Yeah, Nicholas, just to re-emphasize the point that you made there was it was as much about the other things that were going on in the economy as the money that was coming into the economy. And when we've interviewed David McWilliams, he speaks about the 90s being the period when Ireland grew up and accepted that it was an independent country. And I think in the 90s was round about the first time when there was more people who came into the country than left. And these are the things that made a significant change to the Irish economy, that are much more important about, I think, where the capital flows are coming from. So, just to re-emphasize that point completely, that's the type of thing we should be looking at for an independent Scotland, is increasing your population and having a place where people want to come and live and move, rather than, I think, attracting this financial capital, especially through any kind of offshore or tax haven route.
Yeah, and if you look at, there's lots of surveys out there done by the OECD and other sort of international bodies. What is it, the things that attract investment into a country? It turns out that things that attract multinationals to a country are the things that would not surprise you. They, good infrastructure, healthy and educated workforce, the rule of, strong rule of law, financial stability, access to markets. Those are the things they want. And tax usually comes kind of 6th or 7th on the list. It's like when corporate CEOs say we need tax cuts, it's like my kids saying we need ice cream. You kind of want ice cream, but you don't actually need it.
It's not the most important thing.
Nearly all of this investment will happen anyway. And so, what the UK government is now doing with these special investment zones, it's just a case in point. It's going to take a lot of activity that was going to happen anyway. It might relocate it inefficiently into these zones so they can get the subsidies and the perks and the tax breaks, but it ain't going to help the country at all. So yeah, it's just this is not, this is a model that was tried from the 1970s and it was widely considered to be the way forward. But I think people are now seeing through it. I think it just, it clearly hasn't worked, and it's just created this race to the bottom between countries trying to catch up with tax havens. And